Good morning and welcome to day 2 of our coverage of election 92, with the Conservatives still short of the 326 they need to have an absolute majority in the House of Commons. But we know that that's going to happen today. Our prediction now is that the Conservatives are going to end on 334, a majority of 17, a safe majority to take them through a full Parliament, barring accidents, a run of by-election defeats or something like that, but a fairly comfortable majority for John Major. During today, we're going to be out and about in London. We're going to be talking to politicians. We'll be at Downing Street, of course, to watch for the Prime Minister coming out, if he does, from number 10 onto the street, where they give their press conferences now. We'll be outside Mr. Kinnock's home in Ealing and seeing whether there's any reaction from there. He probably needs a good night's sleep, having been down in Wales last night and then come up for that early morning Walworth Road speech. But if there is anything to be heard from Mr. Kinnock, we shall hear that. And Paddy Ashdown of the National Liberal, Liberal Democrats. I'm muddling him up with the National Liberal because he's right next to the National Liberal Club. He's at the Horse Guards Hotel there overnight and will no doubt, in his usual brisk way, emerge quite early and have something to say to the press. There are counts going on also during today. We've still got 31 to come. Brecon and Radnor is having a recount. Richard Livesey of the Liberal Democrats holds that seat at the moment, challenged by Conservatives and by Labour, a three-way marginal, so we shall be watching that. And we'll be down in Westminster at the House of Commons and picking up gossip and tittle-tattle and strong views from MPs and from people who wanted to become MPs and didn't about the way that this election has gone. And with me here, I have Michael Foot, the last leader of the Labour Party, before Neil Kinnock, to talk about the campaign in just a moment. But first, let's go to Peter Snow and have a reminder of how last night went and what there is still to come today. Peter.
David, first the picture that says it all, the story of the share of the vote in election 92. And here it is, the Conservatives, remarkably, with 43% of the vote. They had that under Mrs Thatcher in 83 and 87. Labour, with its third worst since the war, only in 87 and 83 did they have worse than that, 36%. 18% the Liberal Democrats and 3% the others. And the changes that represents on the 87 election, no movement at all in the Conservative share of the vote. Labour up only 4%. That's a national swing of just 2% to Labour against the 8% they needed for an overall majority, 4% to deprive Mr Major of his overall majority. The Liberal Democrats down 5% on the way the alliance performed last time. Look at the map over here. There's the map, still very blue indeed. There are some pockets of red coming up now in the south of England. There were only 2 before. Now there are a few more, Southampton, Itchen, Kingswood. There's the Liberal Democrats' success in Bath. There's the Plaid Cymru success at Ceredigion in Wales. And up in Scotland, remarkably, against all the expectations, the Tories actually building up their number of seats, adding Kincardine and Deeside and Aberdeen South to their number of blue seats up in Scotland. And now let's take a walk up Downing Street. Here we go. There's the front door of number 10 and the seats that decide this election. The battleground seats, most of them blue for Conservative in the last Parliament, some of them gold for the Liberal Democrats. And here's what happened in those seats. Labour had to turn all these seats red for an overall majority, and look what happened. A large number of blue Conservative seats, even right up here among the easiest of all for Labour to gain. Ayr and Stirling in Scotland, and they're scattered all over the country. Bolton North East in the north, Battersea in London, Batley in Spain, in Yorkshire and Humberside, Corby in the Midlands and so on. So all over the place, Tories standing out against the swing to Labour. Let's just lose all the successful defenders and look at the forecast Labour gains. And there we see down to number 44, making adjustment for the one that the Tories win back, by-elections the Tories win back and so on. 40 net Labour gains, leaving a huge gap between them and the winning post, number 94, the 94th seat, and there inside number 10, Mr Major, with a working majority of 17. David.
Peter, thank you very much. Well, Michael Foot was the last leader of the Labour Party before Neil Kinnock. He lost the election in 1983 and Neil Kinnock followed him, and Neil Kinnock has always been thought of as your protege, Mr. Foot, hasn't he, really? It must be rather a blow to you, what's happened today.
Well, he's certainly not my protege, but it's a great blow for Neil Kinnock not to be going to number 10 Downing Street. I certainly thought he was going there. I certainly think he deserved to go there. But I think it's a bad day for the Labour Party, but it's also a bad day for British democracy, in my opinion. Lots of the poorest people in the country, the people who had the worst time, were looking for a change here, and it's not going to happen. They're going to get a further kicks in the teeth over these coming years. And then I think the Tories have fought a pretty dirty campaign, and it's paid off, and that also does harm to democracy. I think the whole idea of turning it onto an attack on Neil Kinnock, that was all planned before by the Conservatives and by Chris Patten and co. So I think that's bad for democracy too. But even now, of course, once again, Scotland and Wales have overwhelmingly voted differently from England, and I believe that's got grave constitutional difficulties for the Constitution, but the Labour Party is the only party that's really understood that. The Conservative Party has once again refused to hear, and so that's going to do, I fear, great injury to the whole of British democracy. So altogether, bad day for British democracy as well as the Labour Party.
Well, you blame it on the electorate for listening to the seductive sounds coming from the Conservative Party.
Yeah.
And it's not like you as a Democrat to blame the electorate for being misled so easily.
The electorate's got a right to do what it wants, but the electorate also, I think, has got a right to be better served by the party that uses the huge amount of money that the Conservatives had, 10, 50 times more than the Labour Party have had in this election and the other elections too. I think the electorate has got a right to have a better use of public money in these matters, particularly when the filthy press, the gutter press, has excelled itself in this election in the way that they have combined with the Conservative Central Office to an attack on Neil Kinnock. So all that's bad for democracy, and I would have thought, even though the BBC would recognise that, you putting to me what the British electorate should do, I think that it's been a very bad day for the way in which we conduct our elections, apart from my natural disappointment about the result. However, we will have to repair it, and of course the Labour Party will start off in this Parliament, even despite the setbacks, with a much stronger position than we had in the last Parliament, and I haven't the slightest doubt that under Neil Kinnock or those around him who are much better list of people to take the jobs of running the country, I'm sure that they will pull together to profit from this defeat and give another chance to the British people to have a better choice.
Was there anything wrong with Labour's policies or with the way that it put them across?
No, I don't
were they
think
all as good as could be expected, or as good as could be achieved?
I think most people who saw what where they presented it would agree that they did. I think most people also agree that they put the case a good deal better than the Conservatives were putting their case. It doesn't alter the fact that at the end, I suppose it was one of the factors was the Tory claim, which they trumpeted right from the beginning to the end, that if the Labour Party was elected, they were going to have to pay much bigger taxes. The figures were presented in a way by the Tory party machine in a way that's absolutely monstrous, a complete denial of the facts. But it's worked, and, when democracy hit like that, I'm afraid it has bad effects. A lot of what's happened here, I fear, has been learnt from the methods in the United States of America where they run these elections. And it's sad that we should be now here adopting in Britain some of the worst methods that they use in the United States of America.
But, Mr. Foot, the Labour Party has moved far away from the position it was when you led it, far away from 83, even though Neil Kinnock defended and said it would have been a good idea had you won in 83. It's given up all sorts of policies dear to your heart. Do you think that it's lost its fighting capacity among the voters by becoming too much a central party?
I saw quite a lot of the election, actually, especially, of course, in Wales.
I know, you went to the constituencies.
There's no lack of fighting spirit in Wales or in Scotland. The Labour Party's done very well in Scotland, really, if you look at the figures, of course. But that, unfortunately, the majority now in England, and the Conservative Party with its majority, doesn't apparently take any account of that, and that is a great threat to the unity of the United Kingdom. But just as it's only in this election that it's the Labour Party has the real chance of holding it together, that's going to be proved, I believe, in the next few years even more so.
A defeated leader went when you were defeated. Does a defeated leader, twice defeated, have to go now?
No, not necessarily at all. I think the vast majority of Labour people up and down the country thought that Neil Kinnock fought a magnificent campaign, and a vast majority of them also, I'm sure, join with me in their bitter resentment against the way in which the attack has been made on Neil Kinnock. I would have thought that every decent person in the country should be ashamed. And by the way, the other thing about the election, I mustn't forget this, poor old Paddy Ashdown, he couldn't tell the difference between the Tories and the Labour Party throughout the whole of the election. I hope you'll learn a bit better as time goes on, because he has contributed to this defeat, and he did it by, I suppose, his advisers told him to. For every time he attacked the Tories, he must attack the Labour Party equally. And I think it's about time he and his supporters discovered the difference between the two.
Mr. Foot, thank you very much. Maybe you'll be able to stay with us for a bit and give us some more illuminations about the Labour Party in its future.
It'll be to your profit, I'm sure, if that were to be the case.
Thank you very much. A couple of results that we've had in. We'll keep this results service going. This is the West Belfast result. Gerry Adams of Sinn Féin defeated by the SDLP. Joe Hendren takes it, a majority of 589. And the Liberal Democrats hold Inverness, Nairn and Lochaber. Sir Russell Johnson holds on to the seat. 458 is his majority. And this is an absolutely fascinating seat, because look at those figures. 26%, 25%, 25%, 23%. Four parties almost within, well, all within a couple of percent of each other. So a four-way marginal. Now let's catch up with what the Prime Minister and the Leader of the Opposition are doing today. Martin Lewis is in Downing Street. Good morning, Martin.
Good morning,
What's happening
David.
today?
Well, the Prime Minister might be trying to grab a few hours' sleep now, but I can tell you that the Civil Service regards it as very much a normal working day. Sir Robin Butler, the head of the Home Civil Service and the Cabinet Secretary, arrived here bang on the dot of 9 o'clock, ready to start a day's work. And in fact, when the Prime Minister arrived here just after 6 o'clock this morning, after a long, long night in Huntingdon, he found that no sooner had he been greeted by the Downing Street staff and officials than civil servants were pressing files into his hand that needed his attention, matters of state. And when the Prime Minister does wake up at about 11 o'clock, and possibly before he comes out here around about midday to talk to the crowds that are already starting to gather down at the entrance to Downing Street, he will have to have started making several important decisions. First of all, he has to decide on his cabinet. That is going to be decided, we hear, not today, but probably about tomorrow lunchtime. And then he's going to fill in the other ministerial appointments. Again, that'll take a little longer, possibly not until Monday. He has then to sit down with Sir Robin and work out the mechanics of setting up the Heritage Ministry, the new ministry that is going to embrace arts and sport and broadcasting and, of course, the National Lottery. And most important of all, he probably has to take a decision delayed because of the election to set up the British component of the UN peacekeeping force that is going to Yugoslavia. So a busy time ahead.
Thank you very much, Martin. Now let's go to Neil Kinnock's house in Ealing. Jenny Bond is there. What are the plans there today?
Well, of course, it's been an absolutely devastating night for Neil Kinnock. One can only imagine what he's feeling in there. He arrived back at about 7 o'clock this morning. There were very few people to greet him, just the press. Mrs. Kinnock went straight in. Mr. Kinnock did wander across. There was one lady here who gave him a silver rose. He then went back to the house, and the only question he answered was when we shouted, what about your future? And he said, well, it's going to be long and wonderful, but he didn't elaborate. He didn't say what he thought he was going to be doing. Since then, the Kinnocks have been inside, and we're told they have no intention at all of coming out today. There are one or two friends with them, and one can imagine they're mulling over what's happened.
Jenny Bond, thank you very much indeed. Well, now let's have some more political reaction to these results. Peter Sissons. Peter, good morning.
Thank you, David. Good morning. Around my table this morning, Ken Livingstone, Shirley Williams, David Mellor, and in Newcastle, Tony Blair. Tony Blair, what's your analysis of the reason for Labour's defeat?
We had a tremendous leap to come from 1987 to actually win an overall majority. We, of course, took many, many seats. I mean, our sense of disappointment, obvious sense of disappointment, must be balanced by the sense of achievement that we took so many seats in different parts of the country. But it was too much to do, so it now appears, to come from where we were in 1987 to actually win an overall majority. But we have vastly reduced the Conservative majority down from around about 100 seats to less than a fifth of that. And I think, too, that what else is very positive in this campaign for us was that in many ways the agenda was ours.
Could it be that John Major read the public mood on tax far better than you did? He saw instinctively that when people told the pollsters they were willing to pay more tax and have better public services, they were not telling the whole truth.
No, I think it was that, in some ways, the Conservatives, I think most people believe, did not deserve to win the election. But the question was ultimately whether people were prepared to come in sufficiently great numbers for the Labour Party, for Labour actually to win power. And as I say, if you actually look at the number of seats we gained, it was very considerable. If you look at the number of seats the Conservatives lost, it was very considerable. But coming from where we were back in the first defeat of 83 and then 87, we couldn't make that final leap, not in the sufficient numbers that we required to win an overall majority or indeed to put the Conservatives out of office. Now, of course, that's a tremendous disappointment. It would be rather strange if it wasn't to us, since we fought, in many ways, a very good campaign. But I do think it should be balanced and measured against that sense of achievement, and also the fact that we won seats in all parts of the country. And we won seats down in the southwest, we won seats in London, which I think was very important, and, of course, we won seats in the northwest and Midlands and the north too.
Now that Mr Kinnock is a two-time loser, does he have your unqualified support as leader for as long as he wants to go on?
That is not even on the agenda today, and let me tell you something about the campaign that Neil Kinnock fought. It was a brilliant campaign. He earned the gratitude and respect of many people, not just in the Labour Party, but throughout the country. I spent quite a long time with them during the course of that campaign, and I saw firsthand the absolutely superb job of leadership that he did, and he has our tremendous respect and gratitude and support.
Let me put the same question to Ken Livingstone. Does Neil Kinnock have your unqualified support as leader for as long as he wants to go on?
Yes, we don't want to get into a leadership struggle. We don't want to say one person is to blame. The whole movement is to blame for this defeat. This is the election where power was really in our hands and we let it slip away. No government in the last 60 years in any Western democracy has gone through a recession as severe as this and been re-elected. And therefore, I think Tony's wrong, and he's being very optimistic. We should have had a commanding majority, perhaps over 100 seats, which is what the economic factors would have led to.
Where does the blame lie? Put your finger on it.
I think the whole party has moved too far to the right, been too frightened to challenge vested interests. We also didn't have our sums add up in all of this. We didn't say we were going to cut defence spending. We didn't say we were going to have any constraints on the export of capital abroad. We said we'd spend more on investment in industry, more on pensions, and people could see those figures couldn't add up. As soon as Labour decided it wasn't going to reduce military spending, you were led inevitably into this tax quagmire. And I found across London and the South East, where the average male earnings are $20,000 a year, that fatal mistake of saying, well, national insurance contributions at $21,000, you're going to have to start paying, meant the average voter in the South East felt our tax policies were hitting him, not the filthy capitalist class, just the ordinary middle-income family.
What do you say to that, Tony Blair?
I don't accept that the shadow budget was a mistake in any way at all. Indeed, I think it was generally regarded as one of the coups of the campaign. It set the agenda for a lot of the time. 8 out of 10 families gained under Labour's proposals. And I think that in terms of the economic agenda, many of the issues that were fought in the campaign were fought very much on our territory. And I do think you have to remember the tremendous uphill struggle that we had. Indeed, I remember people saying, not so many months ago, never mind several years ago, that the task was enormous. Well, we accomplished a lot, we didn't accomplish enough. But I believe that John Smith's shadow budget was very successful indeed.
Shirley Williams, your reaction to the end of the SDP? Rosie Barnes and John Cartwright going down the tube.
Yes, I mean, personal sadness, especially with respect to John Cartwright, who was a first-rate constituency MP. I think it was not helped by David Owen's last-minute declaration that people should vote Conservative, because I think John Cartwright's was fundamentally a Labour constituency that he held by sheer devotion to constituency work. But let me say one other thing as well. I think one of the things that happened in the last few days was both that Labour's vote crumbled vis-à-vis the Conservatives, and so to some extent did ours. And I think one reason for that was because of things like the Sheffield rally, which suddenly showed Neil Kinnock in a triumphalist mode. And I think many people, even now, are frightened of a Kinnock government.
That Sheffield rally was the sort of American politics that Michael Foot was just condemning.
Yes, but of course. No, I'm not saying it helped. I think it didn't help. Actually, I don't agree with Michael. I don't think this was a very American style of campaign. I think there was an awful lot of grassroots work. I think that the moment when John Major took to his soapbox was the exact moment when he fought back with what one might call an English style of campaigning. I have to say, I think Paddy Ashton's campaign was also brilliant. But at the last analysis, people simply stubbornly resisted the idea of a Labour government.
Do you think there's time now for another realignment, yet another realignment in opposition?
Yes, I think probably, because I think what's going to happen is that we're going to get into very, very heavy economic waters. I think what's happening in Japan is probably more relevant to what's going to happen in the next year than anything we've seen so far about the election. I think that's going to mean that the Conservatives are governing at a time of probably deepening economic gloom, and that's going to force Labour and I think the Liberal Democrats into looking at the whole role of opposition. And one final point, I actually believe British democracy can only work if you have changes of government. I think it's very frightening to have 4 governments, one on top of the other. I don't mind what the colour of that government is, because we don't have an underpinning of constitutional rights which would enable us to live through a period of single government. And we're very close to single-party government, at least in England and Wales at the present time.
Does one-party state worry you, David Mellor?
Well, I understand what Shirley is saying, that obviously in a sophisticated democracy, power transfers. I think the story of this election is that actually quite a lot of people looked at that. I think the high number of don't knows at the beginning of the campaign was a sign of people looking probably for exactly those reasons of whether they should make a change. And I think that they peered into the abyss of a Neil Kinnock government and drew back, and that was what was behind the late swing. I think, frankly, if driven to a choice, I think democracy is better sustained by 4 Conservative terms than taking a punt with Neil Kinnock.
Do you think any party will ever go to the country again promising to increase taxes?
Well, I don't know, but, I think that I don't agree with what Ken Livingstone says on policy, but I admire Ken's honesty and candour in a party that seems to have lost the ability to be honest or candid. Somebody once said, could anybody write a good book about the present policy stance of the Labour Party? And of course they couldn't. The Labour Party, in its desperation to get into office, lost its soul. It said things for the soundbite. And I think actually that Sheffield rally did actually sum up where Labour had got to. A lot of empty glitz, like Oscars without anyone having done anything to deserve an award. And actually, people looked at it and saw it was empty as a sort of Easter egg, nicely wrapped, totally hollow in the middle. And I think, Neil Kinnock's bandwagon has become a tumbril.
David Mellor, Tony Blair, Ken Livingstone, Shirley Williams, for now, thank you very much. David.
Well, Scotland had an upset in these elections. They were expecting the Tories to do badly. The Tories did rather well in Scotland. The SNP was hoping to gain seats. It didn't. Labour stayed exactly the same. The Liberal Democrats lost one. Let's just have a look at the picture in Scotland, and then we'll be talking to Alex Salmond of the Scottish National Party about what he thinks the future holds for Scotland. But first, Peter Snow has the Scottish results. Peter.
Indeed, and as you were saying, David, the surprise is in Scotland. There is the surprise. There's Labour down 3% in Scotland, the Tories up 2%, and actually a swing of 2.5% to the Conservatives. The Scottish National Party expected in some polls to be doubling, trebling their share of the vote, up 7% only, and the Liberal Democrats down 6%. And the result of all that, with just one result to come, is a Scotland that looks like this. The Labour Party is still totally dominating Scotland with 49 seats. The Conservatives on 11, up 2 on where they were before, so their worst was the last Parliament, not, as some people expected, this one. The Liberal Democrats 8, down 2. The Liberal Democrats have lost 2 seats. They've lost Kincardine. That big by-election win last November has gone down to the Conservatives, and the Conservatives also incidentally winning Aberdeen South. And the SNP, instead of doubling their representation in Scotland, remain on 4. They've lost Govan, so no advance for the SNP in Scotland, David.
So we're joined now by Alex Salmond. Mr. Salmond, good morning.
Good morning.
Well, now, what do you make of this for the voters of Scotland? They're back in the position of having a Tory government in London and having voted Labour in Scotland. What do you deduce from that they should now do? I mean, you'll say vote for you, but it doesn't seem to be working out that way.
Well, of course, we've got an immediate opportunity for that, because in only 4 weeks' time, Scotland goes to the polls again, and district elections are length and bread for Scotland. But let's not underrate the extent of the SNP progress. We did increase our vote by over 50%. We did come second in 40 of the seats across Scotland. I accept that's not the targets we set ourselves, but it's a very substantial advance for the argument of independence in Europe. Now, what stopped us advancing further in the last few days of the campaign was the absolute conviction from the pundits, the pollsters, that the Labour Party had the keys to 10 Downing Street in the palm of their hand. We found it very difficult to advance, against Labour claims that they were about to deliver self-government for Scotland. These claims have now been shown to be empty, and Labour will pay a very high price indeed.
And Labour Party supporters thought they were going to win all over the United Kingdom. It's not just in Scotland that people were deceived by the strength of the Tory vote. You can't blame the people of Scotland. You can't say they were wrongly seduced by Labour.
Oh, I'm not blaming the people of Scotland. I'm blaming the Labour Party leadership in Scotland, who now 4 times have claimed that the nation of Scotland could achieve self-government through voting for the Labour Party and through the Westminster route. I mean, this is the morning after the night before, and we all have to learn lessons from what's happened. And surely the lesson for Scotland is that the devolution route, that's power by going through the Westminster route, is a dead-end alley. It's going nowhere. And the only route available to us now is independence in Europe. There are many people, of course, not just in the Scottish National Party, but in the ranks of the Liberal Party at high level, many people and many activists in the Labour Party who actually believe in independence in Europe. Hitherto, their argument with the SNP has been on timescale, whether to go there in 1 bound or 2 bounds. I think that argument has now been settled, and I would appeal to these people to rally to the Independence in Europe banner before the district elections in 4 weeks' time.
And why did the Tories do so well, or relatively well?
Well, I think relatively is the word.
Well, you Alex Salmond, you were saying in the debate we had up in Scotland before the election that the Tories would lose almost every seat. I mean, that was the generally accepted view. They'd have about 3 seats left. Instead, they've gained 2.
Well, of course, the Tory party's performance in this election is not far off their performance in the 1987 election, which was generally acknowledged as a disaster. The question for Scotland, of course, is should a party which contains 25% of the vote govern the Scottish people? Should we have policies imposed upon the Scottish nation that we haven't voted for now 4 times over? If I can put it to you, the constitutional crisis in Scotland is not going to go away. I think it's going to re-emerge very starkly in 4 weeks' time at the district elections. If I could offer you the words of a Scottish song, I think my message today would be, laugh, false Whigs, in the midst of your glee. You've not seen the last of my bonnets and me.
You wouldn't like to sing it for us, would you?
Not this time, David, but you might tempt me in another programme, particularly after the district election results.
Alex Salmond, thank you very much for joining us. Well, now, Gail Foley is down Innislewin, Blackwood Market in Neil Kinnock's constituency. Let's join her this morning.
It's busy and bustling here in the market at Blackwood in the middle of Mr Kinnock's Islwyn constituency, but the mood is certainly flat and doomy. I have with me some of Mr Kinnock's supporters and some of his friends, some of his closest friends, starting with Doreen Moore, his agent for the last couple of years. Doreen, we saw you last night looking extremely depressed when the results were coming through. Tell me, what was Mr Kinnock saying at that point?
Obviously, he was very disappointed, and I think he summed it up this morning by saying that he felt sorrow and dismay for the people of Britain because of the results over the country as a whole. Obviously, here in Islwyn, we had an absolutely fantastic result, and it's such a shame that it wasn't reflected in the rest of the country.
What about your own mood this morning yourself? You've worked very hard for this. You were convinced that he was going to be the Prime Minister, or at least be a power in a hung government.
Yes, we were, and obviously I feel extremely disappointed and really sorry for the people in the country that needed a Labour government.
Royce Sorrellis, you've known Mr Kinnock for 25 years. When he last had a defeat, he had to be built up. He was depressed last time. What do you think he'll be feeling this time, and will there need to be a similar building up?
Well, no doubt, as Doreen has just said, he's a very disappointed man, and we share that disappointment. But he's fought a great campaign. He's going to continue to fight for the Labour Party, for the people of Britain. We're going to support him every inch of the way. One day we'll get there, I'm sure we will. In the meantime, it's most unfortunate that the people of Britain will have to pay the price. They've paid it for many years now with unemployment, with repossessions. The homeless have suffered. Redundancies have been terrific.
You're certainly paying the price this morning.
The price will have to be paid, unfortunately.
And Alan Fox from Tredegar, you've known him for even longer, perhaps. You signed him up, didn't you, as a Labour Party member?
Yeah,
what do you put it down to? You're from a neighbouring constituency. What do you put it down to, this defeat?
I'm no guru, you know. We had Hattersley on this morning. He didn't know the answer, so why should I? I think perhaps we have to look at the whole media thing itself.
And there, the media will have to stop you. Alan Fox, I'm sorry, we've come to the end of our time. And from the Market Square here in Blackwood, back to the studio in London.
Thank you very much. We're coming up to news time, and in a moment we'll go over to the newsroom and join Chris Lowe for the latest news. Then we'll be back here with more opinion, comment, insights and results in our coverage of the second day of election 92. And welcome back to our coverage of the second day of the election. We've had 620 results in now of the 651 that are to come, and this is the state of the parties at the moment. The Conservatives on 321, a net loss of 35. Labour on 269, up 39. Liberal Democrats on 17, down 1, and the Nationalists on 7. Others 6, down 3. Well, now, Jill Dando was up in Manchester last night, and Brighton Breezy is back there this morning. Jill, good morning.
Yes, good morning, David. Well, as Manchester wakes up to a fourth Conservative victory, I'm joined now by a group of people to give their views on how they hope to see the future shaping up for women and children. Now, Lindsay, you're a single mum with 2 children. What's your message now to the new Conservative government?
Well, I would be asking them the same as I've always asked them, to actually take families seriously, particularly one-parent families who've been hit so badly in the last few years by unemployment, rising costs, decreases in social security payments. But I'm not very hopeful. They've not listened before. I don't think this government's going to listen.
Well, Lindsay, thank you very much. Moving on now to Clementine Allen. Now, you're an employer with 4 restaurants in the Manchester area.
Right, yes.
Do you have any difficulties employing women?
I have lots of difficulties employing women. It's not that I can't pay them, it's that they can't afford to work because of the ridiculous benefit system that we have that inhibits them working, because they lose so many of their benefits if they work for me and earn money, and it seems to me that something's got to be done about that.
Thank you very much. Well, moving on now to Debbie. Do you find it difficult to get work with children?
I certainly do, yes. You go for an interview and all they seem interested about is whether you've got adequate care for your children. That's a case of no adequate facilities for childcare. You can't take them anywhere. Private nurseries are so expensive.
Right. Well, Kate, would perhaps a Labour Ministry of Women have helped you at all?
It certainly would, and many other women as well. Childcare is not just a women's issue, and Ministry for Women would certainly address many of the issues involved in childcare problems. But the Tory government seem very concerned to put childcare problems back on women, many of whom are single parents, and it is actually a nationwide problem, not just a women's problem.
But the Conservatives are saying that they're going to encourage as many people as they can to actually introduce childcare facilities, nursery places.
They are, but they're still saying it's private industry or women themselves who've got to sort it out. They're not saying on a government level that there are going to be nursery places for all children who need it, or after-school care for those with school-age children who are working.
Thank you very much. Now then, Lisa, the end of the line here. What's your message to the Conservative government?
I'd just like to see more childcare for the under-5s. You know, I think it's very important that people can get back to work and, like myself, go back to college. And if there's no childcare facilities there, we won't be able to do that.
Right. Well, moving back now again to Clementine, I think the only employer here. Do you think that the minimum wage would have been any help or not?
Well, I operate in an industry that does have a minimum wage, and that operates against. I had a woman last week that I employ say, "Can you pay me less because I would like to work more hours?" And I had to say, "No, I can't pay you less, otherwise I'm going to be prosecuted for not paying you enough money." So that's why I was very much against a minimum wage, which would also add to inflation.
Right. Well, ladies, thank you very much indeed. That's a brief look at the views here in Manchester. Now back to London.
Jill Dando, thank you very much. I'm joined by Cecil Parkinson, former chairman of the Conservative Party, rather critical during the campaign. But I have to congratulate you. You were the first person last night to say that you thought the Tories were heading for an overall majority, when Michael Heseltine was saying no one knew what was going on. Now, how did you know what was going on, or was it just a wild guess?
No, it wasn't. I've been in 41 marginal constituencies in the last 12 days, and one felt over the last week people coming back to us. The don't-knows, with some reluctance in some cases, were turning back to the Conservative Party. The overwhelming message was, we don't want Neil Kinnock and we don't want a Labour government. And once they began to believe that the Liberals posed an opportunity for the Labour Party instead of a threat to them, they started to turn back to us. One felt it, one sensed it. And the Harris poll on Tuesday confirmed it.
What do you say to what Michael Foot, who was sitting in that chair only 20 minutes ago, said, that this was the most scurrilous campaign by the Conservative Party and the Tory gutter press that chose to vilify Neil Kinnock and frighten the electorate into not voting for him?
It's the cry of the loser throughout the ages that it simply wasn't fair. I don't believe it was a scurrilous campaign. I believe that Neil Kinnock was exposed as a slightly shallow person, and his own party gave the best evidence of that. They sheltered him from contact with any living electors who weren't handpicked. I mean, they demonstrated to the public their lack of confidence in him, and in his performances on some of the big programmes, he floundered the moment he was away from his minders, and I think gradually the people began to feel that he simply wasn't the right man.
The Tories did get into difficulty during the campaign, didn't there? There was a moment, I mean, the moment when you spoke out about the campaign and said you thought it should be conducted in a more positive and vigorous way.
Well, I think you ought to set that against the background that the Times that day said our campaign the previous day touched new heights of bumbling ineptitude. And I was replying to that criticism and actually saying that that wasn't a fair criticism. We'd had a couple of bad days, but we had the right policies, the right man, the better machine, and we were going to win. Well, so I was defusing a much more serious criticism and admitting that things hadn't gone as well. You remember the War of Jenny's Ear? It was that incident that I was commenting on when we allowed ourselves to be dragged into an argument which I didn't think did us any good.
Have a look at, I don't know whether you believe opinion polls after last night, but have a look at Peter Kellner's opinion poll on why people voted the way they did, and we can talk about that.
Can I just repeat something I said in the small hours of the morning? This is from a nationwide exit poll, which, although it understated the Tory lead, did show the Tories clearly ahead and was not far out of line in terms of the share of party support. So we think it's a reasonably good indicator of what people were really thinking.
It was better than the opinion polls before election day.
Substantially better than any of the opinion polls that came out yesterday morning. And we repeated some questions that were asked earlier in the campaign about which party people trusted on different issues. Now, let's take two Labour issues, health and schools. Now, at the start of the campaign, Labour had a clear 24-point lead over the Conservatives on health and a 13-point lead over the Conservatives on schools. And what's happened? Both figures came down very sharply by yesterday, halving the lead on health and the lead on schools practically disappearing. Now, part of that, I think, can be explained by the fact that there's some evidence of some Labour supporters staying at home. So we've got into a slightly more Tory sample in the sense of who was actually around and about at polling stations yesterday. But that doesn't explain all of it. There does seem to have been some positive movement in the Conservatives' ratings.
Where did the 24% come from? Where did the first figures come from?
They came from an NOP poll for the BBC Newsnight and for the Independent.
So you're not comparing like with like, actually?
That was a poll of the electorate. Well, what I'm saying to you, David, is that even if you make some allowance for the fact that that was a poll of the electorate, and this was a poll of yesterday's voters, and taking into account some Labour abstentions, that doesn't explain the whole of that movement. Right. There does seem to have been some shift of sentiment towards the Conservatives. Now let's look at two Conservative issues on taxation and on prices. And here we see, on taxation, the Conservatives led Labour, but modestly at the start of the campaign by 7%. By yesterday, that lead had trebled to a 21-point lead for Conservative over Labour as the party that people trust most. On prices, a stronger Conservative lead at the beginning also has gone up to a 20-point lead. So, in other words, Labour's lead went down on its issues, the Tories' leads went up on their issues.
So, Cecil Parkinson, you fought campaigns. Yes. Why does that happen? I mean, this campaign has actually been going on for 6 months. Everybody's heard the arguments rehearsed ad nauseam. Why does it take just the last week or two, or day or two, or the final moment of putting the cross on, for people to have that switch Peter shows, quite a big switch of opinion?
I think that people really start to focus in the last few days. It was true in the 83 campaign. We started behind on the big issue in that campaign was unemployment. By the time we finished, we'd gone ahead. So people don't really focus. They hear politicians squabbling before the election, but when the election is on and the day to vote gets nearer, they start to focus. And if you look at the last 3 or 4 elections, we start to come through and win the argument, which is what happened this time.
Well, John Major's won the election. What should he do now? Do you expect new policies? Do you expect changes in Cabinet?
Well, we've been the government. We've produced our public expenditure plans. We produced our tax plans. In our manifesto, we said what we're going to do. And we'll carry on with exactly what we've said we would do before the election and what we promised the electorate we would do during the election.
What about the Cabinet?
Well, I'm sure...
I mean, you're out of it. You can advise what you should do.
I wouldn't dream of
friend
advising.
Of the party.
They're all friends of mine. I don't want to see any of them lose their jobs. But obviously, John Major now has total command of the party, and he'll be choosing his own cabinet, and he may want to make changes. I've no way of knowing what he'll do, but I do know that he's proud of his team. and he's grateful to them for the support they've given him. And I wouldn't expect to see any major and dramatic changes, but that must be entirely a matter for him.
Some say he's not a very good picker of people, that he shouldn't have made Lamont Chancellor, and that he shouldn't have made Patten Chairman because of the problem that he had over his seat in Bath, which indeed he lost.
Well, it's always easy with the benefit of hindsight to say those things. I think John was very grateful to Norman Lamont for the work he'd done as his campaign manager in getting the leadership. And Norman, as Chief Secretary, clearly wanted to be Chancellor, and John rewarded him for his loyalty by giving him the job. Now,
is that how the great offices of state should be given?
Norman's also had been Chief Secretary, is extremely competent economically, and John had confidence in him. No, it wasn't the only reason wasn't loyalty, but obviously he wanted to reward a friend who'd worked for him and whom he believed could do the job. And I think he was right, by the way. I think Norman's had a very difficult time. He's picked up the fag end of a deep recession, and he's had to guide the economy through it. And all the signs are now that we are beginning to come out of the recession.
So, just briefly, would you expect him to stay there?
I would hope he would, but that must be entirely a matter for the Prime Minister.
Sir Parkinson, thanks very much. Let's go out and about again. We'll join Alenka Frankel now, who's in Huntingdon at the Conservative Party headquarters, John Major's headquarters, that is, in Huntingdon. Let's go up there.
Yes, indeed, David. Here in the Conservative Association in Huntingdon, where John Major increased his already record majority of 27,000 to 36,000 in yesterday's poll, I'm joined by a group of local Conservatives. On my left, three candidates, two of whom were safely returned to Westminster. The first, Mark Bishop, who failed to hold Cambridge for the Conservatives. Malcolm Moss, who was returned with an increased majority, as was Jim Pace, I may add. Lord Renton, who held the seat here from 1945 until 1979 when he handed over to John Major. Beryl Robertson, the Mayor of Huntingdon. Mike Harford, the Chairman of the Conservative Association here in Huntingdon. Neville Sanders, the leader of the Conservative group in Peterborough. And Simon Nixon, the former President of the Cambridge Union Debating Society. Mark Bishop, what went wrong in Cambridge?
Well, it was a very disappointing result for us, but we started the campaign as a three-way marginal, and we ended last night as a two-way marginal. The Liberal vote went very considerably down, and a large part of it obviously was picked up by the Labour Party. But the feeling that we got on the streets was that there was enormous support for John Major, and the message that we were getting was that there was a great deal of support for him, particularly, obviously, amongst our supporters. And our Conservative vote was pretty much constant from 87.
Malcolm Moss, although the feeling may have been very positive for John Major on the street, there was a lot of talk about a lacklustre campaign. Has that now been proved wrong? I presume you think it has.
Well, indeed, yes. I increased my majority considerably in the campaign. One of the important factors, of course, was the feeling on the ground that the people didn't want Neil Kinnock in number 10 or a Labour government. But an underrated factor here is that the Conservative Party has an army of workers out there, and they're knocking on doors and they're talking to people. And it's our army of workers, I think, that won the argument on the doorstep.
There was some criticism, though, of the management of the campaign. Jim Pace, do you think that was, in retrospect, not justified?
Well, it's so easy to use hindsight. It's a skill we've all got. And clearly, in the first part of the campaign, there was a lot of criticism coming on the doorsteps. I was getting it, I'm sure we all were, from people who wanted us to win, thinking we were beginning to throw it away. Once we got away from what appeared to be a bit of bickering and actually concentrated on our policies and the vision of John Major, which came through so clearly, really, on Tuesday night, it was absolutely clear in the last few days it was all moving our way.
Lord Renton, you've seen 10 campaigns, some of them very close. Was this the closest, though?
Nationally, this was, of course, not the closest vote, no.
But as a campaign, did you feel it to be the most neck and neck?
No, because I took the view, from my own observation, from the outset that John Major was right when he said that the opinion polls did not reflect true opinion and that he was confident that he would win. And he certainly deserved to win because not only has he turned out to be a great Prime Minister, but locally he's been the most marvellous constituency member. He's remained modest, friendly, charming, hard-working in Huntingdon. And I'm not surprised that he's enormously increased his huge majority. It's a wonderful achievement. And, of course, Norma is so popular locally, too.
Beryl Robertson, obviously John Major is an extremely popular local man, as we've just heard. But did you ever have any sneaky doubts?
About John Major? No. I knew John Major would get in with a whacking majority.
But doubts about the campaign as a whole?
I'm a pessimist by nature, I must admit. But, yeah, I'm going to be honest and say that I did have my doubts, and I'm greatly relieved.
So you weren't stone cold certain, as he said he was?
I'm afraid not.
Why? What made you doubt?
I was a bit worried. I thought it was lacklustre until John got out his soapbox. And from that moment, I seemed to feel uplifted more. I think the country, that's what they wanted to see, in spite of the media, I should say, denigrating it.
Was he perhaps ill-advised, do you think, at the beginning of his campaign?
No, I think they played it the way they thought it should be played. They found it wasn't working, so John decided he would go on to another tack entirely.
Mike Harford, are you happy with the way the campaign was run, or would you have liked something different?
I think we ran a very good campaign. It was quite clear in John Major's mind all the time that he was going to win with a majority, however slim. I blame the media a little bit, if you don't mind me putting it a bit into your court, because I think there's been far too much attention on opinion polls, which have been proved to be wrong, and not enough on issues. I think if that came out earlier on in the campaign, it wouldn't be lacklustre, as you said.
Mrs Thatcher, of course, was known as a conviction politician. She had a vision, and John Major hasn't perhaps had the opportunity to show the vision that he may now have. Is he now his own man? Is he able to inspire the nation with a vision, set us all on fire?
Yes, I think so. Mrs Thatcher is a very hard act to follow. She was the right person in the right place at the right time, and she put the great back into Britain. We now need a continuation of our policies with probably a softer line. And I think John Major's the man to do it.
In what way softer?
Margaret came over as a rather hard character at the end of the day. And I think that put some of the electors off. They felt that she'd lost her soul. I don't think she lost her soul. I think that she was a woman of great conviction, and she went on and on and on with her convictions. And for the sake of all of us, it's a jolly good job she did, otherwise we wouldn't be where we are now.
Simon Nixon, you're not a member of the Bruges Group, but you say you're a sympathiser. Do you think Mrs Thatcher should have stayed on, and you could perhaps have been returned with a bigger majority here in Britain?
Well, she didn't stay on, so it's very difficult to say, isn't it, whether she would have won if she had. But I think if you remember back to when she did lose the leadership election, there was very clear grounds for her moving aside at the time, and I'm very glad that John Major's won as he has. But I do hope that he won't allow himself to be badgered into going against voting for a federal Europe, and I hope that he will continue to uphold Britain's sovereignty, Britain's independence, and I hope that he will continue Mrs Thatcher's great traditions.
Finally, very briefly, does the Conservative Party now stand as the party of Euro caution, an anti-European party? Lord Renton.
Not anti-European, but cautiously European. I do hope that we shall not get any closer to bureaucracy in Brussels. I think it would be disastrous and would prevent the larger Europe that John Major has said and rightly said that we should now be aiming for.
Beryl Robertson, gentlemen, thank you very much.
Alenka Frankel from Huntingdon. Now, let's just have a look at how things stand. We've got 620 results declared, and the reason we're here on the air is because we have 31 results to come in, and because the Conservatives haven't yet reached the magic 326 that takes them through into an overall majority. But with 620 results in, that's the picture. 321 Conservative, 269 Labour. Look at the Conservative drop, just the net drop so far of 35, and Labour an overall gain of only 39. They needed 94 to take them through to the winning post. Liberal Democrats on 17, down 1, and the Nationalists on 7, others on 6. So that's the state of the parties. Let's have a look at the swing between the parties and how it illustrates what happened last night. Peter.
Well, here is our swingometer. There is the red arrow for the swing to Labour, the blue arrow for the swing to Conservative over there, and there are the 100 or so blue figures representing the Conservative MPs who were vulnerable to a Labour swing before this election. What Mr Kinnock had to do was to push this pendulum, to push this swing right the way up here, turning these blue MPs red right the way up to 8% if he was to achieve an overall Labour majority. What has actually happened is a national swing of just 2%, not 8%, but 2%. Now, if that had been typical of these marginal seats, then only about 20 or so of these blue MPs would have turned red. But look what actually happened. Not only a lot of these here, but quite a few beyond the national swing have turned red. There has been a bigger swing in the vulnerable, marginal Conservative seats to Labour than the national swing. So Labour have actually had a bit of a bonus here. They've done better in the seats they had to do well in, and that has been something of an advantage, but nothing like, of course, enough to win the election. There, for example, is Cambridge up there. They gained Cambridge, which required a 6% swing. The best they did was Southampton Itchin here, where they got a swing big enough to turn that blue Conservative MP red. That was a 6.5% swing. And the regional pattern is quite interesting as well. The regional pattern is really quite varied. Up here, let me move the pendulum back so that you can see exactly how the regional swings were. There is a 3% swing to the Conservatives in Scotland, resulting in the Tories picking up a couple of seats, one of them a Labour seat. In the north, the actual swing was 2% to Labour, just 2% to Labour. In the Midlands, 4% to Labour. In Wales, 3% to Labour. In London, 3%. And in the south, 3% as well. That is the measure of Labour's disappointment here, but because the swing in the marginals was a little bit more than that average national swing, so they picked up a few more seats than they would otherwise have done. David.
We'll rejoin Peter Sissons and his guests. Peter.
Well, we're joined by Sir Norman Fowler, who's in Birmingham. Good morning, Sir Norman.
Morning.
Now, you were with the Prime Minister during his campaign. Why did the pollsters get it wrong and John Major got it right?
Well, I think what we felt during the campaign itself was that the opinion polls were consistently understating our support. We went to constituency after constituency, and literally candidate after candidate was saying, look, we're doing well here. The only thing we can't understand are the opinion polls. It was rather exactly like the 1970 general election. If you remember, in 1970, we were shown, just going into the last straight, we were shown 12% behind Labour. And in fact, we won that election. It was the same kind of feeling all over again. But
what was the issue? What was the issue?
What was the issue in the campaign, or what was the issue
in this campaign?
I think that one of the major issues was literally the leadership itself. I mean, I think that this election is a personal triumph for John Major as Prime Minister. I think that the public compared his position with that of Neil Kinnock, and I think that that came over very strongly. I think the second major issue which came over was this, that I think that John Major set out his policies clearly and distinctly, and on a whole range of subjects like tax and on proportional representation, the Labour Party lacked credibility. It wasn't always that one was clear on, for example, PR, exactly where they stood.
Now, during this campaign, in the back of the bus or the back of the car, was the Prime Minister busy plotting a root and branch reconstruction of his government?
I think we were much more concerned about fighting the general election. You see, I think one of the kind of great things the Prime Minister did was to take the campaign to the people themselves. And I think when the history books are written of the campaign, it will be seen how distinctive his campaign was in the way that he went onto the streets. In Chester, for example, we had, I suppose, a crowd of 2,000, over 2,000 people on the streets, the kind of public meetings that everyone said were impossible to organise. But that was what we were doing in the campaign bus, not actually doing great reconstructions or constructions or whatever of the government.
Do you expect to be asked to join the government?
I keep on being asked this. I haven't actually given it any thought until this morning.
If asked, will you serve?
I think it's a great hypothetical question, and what I would prefer to say is this, that it's been a great fun, apart from everything else, being with the Prime Minister, being with John Major during the campaign, and personally I'm delighted that he's done so fantastically well, and that's my reward, if you like, as far as the election's concerned.
Sir Norman Fowler, thank you. Now, David Mellor, you heard Neil Kinnock this morning saying that the homeless, the sick, the old will have to pay the price for this victory. What's your reaction when you hear that said?
Well, I think he just read the speech that he made in 1983. You remember it was one of his great rants about don't be old, don't be poor. As it happens, the material circumstances of all sections of the community then improved dramatically. And I think that we stand on the threshold of a recovery. That recovery is possible, as we can now see from the way the financial markets have reacted to this. And I think the 90s could be very good years for Britain, and good years for everybody in Britain.
But a whole generation of Tories like you have never known opposition, never known defeat. Is that not a recipe for arrogance?
No, not at all. I don't feel remotely arrogant, and I don't think any of us fought the campaign in an arrogant way. And if I may say so, if arrogance, or rather hubris, was displayed by any party during this campaign, it was by Labour. The moment there was a favourable poll, I mean, you'd think, Neil Kinnock was already president. And I think, frankly, that grated on people. I had no difficulty finding people in Putney, interestingly, in the bits of Putney that used to be solidly Labour, who the more he leapt up and down on these rallies, punching his fists and looking as though, he was heavyweight champion of Tredegar, the more people were turned off. And I think that may have quite a lot to do with his defeat.
Let me just ask Shirley Williams and Ken Livingstone this. We talked to Shirley before about a possible realignment on the left, but Ken Livingstone, is it true to say, my memory serves me right, you are an electoral reformer, you are a PR man?
Yes, along with that other great moderate Arthur Scargill. We've both been committed to PR for 20 years.
And do you think the Labour Party can now resist it?
No, I think there's a historical inevitability. It's going to come one way or another. I think the danger now, though, is that Labour will seize it in a panic. Not because it really believes in it, because it sees it as the only way of ever getting rid of the Tories. And you can't adopt a policy on that basis. You've actually got to believe in it and have the other package of constitutional reforms as well.
But the only way to get it, Shirley Williams, would be having a government that would do it. And that would mean an electoral pact between Labour and the Liberal Democrats at the next election to try to get into power on that basis to change the system.
Well, I think
is that such a pie in the sky?
Yes, it's pie in the sky. I think it's a not if but when. I mean, I agree with Ken. I think it will come, but I don't know when it will come. It may not come in this coming Parliament. It may not even come in the Parliament beyond that. But that it's coming, I'm quite sure. I don't think there'll be likely to be an electoral pact by the next election. I think the changes will come well before the next election. I would look 2 years down the track. I think we're going to see substantial changes, new alignments all over again in British politics. One final point. I hope Dave Miller's right. I don't think it's quite true to say that, at least relatively, the poor have done very well under this government. They've done rather badly. They have actually been the losers, relatively speaking. And I think we're in for a rough economic time, and I hope that Mr Major, true to the way he put himself across, will actually protect those most able to be vulnerable to that, more than has happened under Mrs Thatcher.
Thank you all very much. David.
The war of Jennifer's ear goes on, that Labour Party political. Both mother and father have been speaking to the press this morning. The mother says the result is fantastic. The father says he's shocked and bewildered. We go to Manchester now and join Jill Dando.
Thank you very much indeed, David. Well, these politicians get around dawn at Downing Street and now mid-morning in Manchester. The Prime Minister, John Major, you must be delighted with the way this has turned out for you.
Well, yes, it's a remarkable result, if I may say so. I'm delighted. I hoped I might lose 20 or 30 seats. In the event, it looks like I might lose as many as 40. It's a remarkable result. I think, indeed, if we'd lost 15, it would have been something of a slap in the face. We've lost 40. It's a remarkable endorsement of our policies.
Now, do you feel you fought a good campaign? Some suggested it had perhaps lacklustre.
No, there's no doubt. We fought a wonderful campaign. It was a clean campaign. I campaigned on a soapbox. I need hardly remind you. We campaigned not on personalities, but on issues, like Neil Kinnock's personality. It was a wonderful campaign. There's no reason for you to criticise it.
Now, you did lose one or two of your key members, namely Chris Patten and Linda Chalker. That must be a disappointment for you?
Yes, well, I was gobsmacked, if I may say so. But no, I mean, Chris Patten himself was predicting a double whammy. I think that's what we saw. Naturally, it's always very sad when any Conservative cabinet minister loses their seat. It is, after all, the part they talk out of. But these things are politics.
What about Cheltenham, John Taylor, the man who lost his seat there?
Well, yes, he came from a minority. He was a barrister. And I think, if I may say so, it was rather unwarranted of the Liberal Democrats. They made a great play of the fact he was a barrister. It was an unfair campaign. It was, if I may say so, rather smutty. But alas, I fear that's a problem for them.
And turning now to the future, your future policies, how will the NHS be affected now?
Well, you may have seen that our wonderful past leader, Mrs Thatcher, was at the McAlpines last night. We hope to see some sponsorship of the National Health Service. We hope to see McAlpine sponsoring some bypass operations, where, indeed, people, instead of having stitches, can look forward to a nice row of orange cones down the front. That would be a remarkable improvement. We look forward to negotiations on Europe. Indeed, if I may say so, I'll be taking my soapbox everywhere in Europe. I look forward to that.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Prime Minister. And now I'm joined now by the Leader of the Opposition, Neil Kinnock. Mr Kinnock, a frustrating day for you.
It is, if I may say so, Jill, a very frustrating day. I must say I'm as frustrated as the man on election call who tried to tell John Major what he thought of him and couldn't, alas, get the egg down the telephone line. It's a sad day for me. It's a sad day for Britain.
Now, another Conservative minister has just come into the fray. We're joined now by Ken Clarke. Mr Clarke, the issue of PR, do you think that's perhaps over and out now?
Oh, yeah, PR was always an issue for sissies. I mean, I don't approve of PR. I never approve of PR. I mean, PR's for namby-pamby politicians. I mean, PR lets minority groups in. I'm very happy to see a system that allows you to govern for 18 years with 43% of the majority. That's marvellous for me, wonderful for Britain.
Very briefly, Malcolm Rifkind, what about the issue of devolution now?
Well, I think Scotland cannot look forward now, if I may say so, Jill, to devolution, but to some measure of privatisation. We should be looking forward in the next few weeks to bringing forward the selling of shares in Scotland plc, and the people of England can show more of an interest in Scotland than the people of Scotland obviously have by voting against us. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now, David, with that, and Rory Bremner, of course, back to London.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jill. Well, now let's go round the headquarters and talk to our reporters who are at headquarters about reaction today. John Sopel is at the Liberal Party headquarters, the National Liberal Club, recognisable by its dark brown, pale brown and green decor. John, good morning.
Good morning, David.
What's actually happened there? What are people saying about the rather disappointing consequences of the election for the Liberals?
Well, as you suggest, I think there's a feeling of bitter disappointment. I think the evening started with great hopes, like so many other election nights, for the Liberal Democrats or the Liberals or the SDP, where they thought they were on the threshold of something big. This was the election where they were going to make the big breakthrough. And as people started leaving here at about 4:30 in the morning, they were very, very upset that they hadn't done that, that they had actually lost some seats that they thought they were in absolutely no danger of losing, that their national share of the vote had gone down as well. So they were very disappointed about that. They'd fought a professional campaign and it hadn't gone as well. I'm joined now by Simon Hughes, who won across the river at Southwark and Bermondsey handsomely. Simon Hughes, not such a good result nationally.
I think your analysis was right. During the weeks up to yesterday, people built up their hopes. And the emotion carries you away, and you think, yes, we can do it. And that odd statistical balance of getting in there and holding the balance was a possibility, and the opinion pollsters confirmed that. What they didn't tell us was how people were going to react to the opinion polls. So, emotionally, people have gone away disappointed. Objectively, let me just put the other side, objectively, it's not nearly as bad as that. We are one seat down, and we have the largest third-party presence, 21 seats probably, that we've had in Britain since the war.
Was it a good campaign? Do you think that perhaps by the end people felt that maybe you'd been a bit too pious, you'd struck up too many demands of what you would want in a hung parliament and people were put off?
No, it was a very good campaign. We set out the agenda, we were clear, it was internationalist, it was about Europe, a sound economy, the environment, education. We stuck to it. We got into the position where it looked like balance. We raised the issue as to how it's justifiable to have a minority government, a government with 6 out of 10 people voting against it, as we have again this morning, commanding majority in Parliament. And that was a perfectly proper question. And no, on the doorsteps, people responded very positively. The only thing that happened was in the very last days, the prospect of a Labour government turned people to go back to vote Tory, and they came away from us.
Simon Hughes, thank you very much for the moment.
John Sopel there, and now John Fryer we're joined by, who's at Labour Party headquarters in Walworth Road. John, has an inquest already begun?
An inquest was going on all through the night as I sat with union leaders and union officials watching the election unfold. These are people, after all, who make a living out of organising and watching the conduct of ballots and voting. And I can tell you that from the very, very first result in Sunderland, total gloom descended. There were discussions all the way through the night as to why this should have happened. I think there's a general view amongst most of the unions that Labour peaked at that big rally in Sheffield, that they really had nothing much to say over the last few days of the campaign, and that was a mistake. I think the issue of tax also, especially amongst skilled workers, counted. But recriminations of a personal nature against Mr Kinnock, I don't detect anything of that at this moment.
Do they have any idea about what to do next?
What they're confused by is these very patchy results. which don't seem to indicate why people necessarily all voted as they did. And I think that inquest is going to go on for a very long time. If you can't decide why it was that people didn't vote for Labour in the way that the opinion polls had earlier been describing, it's very difficult to blame Mr Kinnock or the Kinnock personality for not turning out the vote on the day. So I don't think there's any pressure whatsoever on Mr Kinnock. I think the union leaders' general reaction will be to let him take a decision about what he believes he should do. I think we're going to be into a lot of huddles behind closed doors. We're not going to get a lot of big wrangles amongst the unions about Labour's next moves.
So would your impression be that the unions will still acquiesce in further changes in the constitution of the Labour Party that removes them even more from than they've been removed already from decision-taking about the leadership and about party policy? Do they recognise that maybe they are part of the trouble?
I don't think they are particularly part of the trouble, as you say. I think, nevertheless, there are plenty of unions who recognise that it is an electoral liability and it can be played hard against the Labour Party that they are, as it were, in the pockets of the unions. Yes, I think you're going to see more constitutional change within the Labour Party as far as the unions are concerned, and I think, picking up on some previous discussions you've been having, that this issue of proportional representation is going to run quite hard. I think a lot of people at grassroots level in the Labour Party are in favour of proportional representation, some of them quite surprising perhaps on the left. And I think that's going to pick up quite a lot of steam over the coming months and years.
John Fryer, thank you very much. We join Vivian White now at Conservative Party headquarters. Vivian, good morning.
Good morning. Well, there were cheers here audible when they first got the first whisper that they might be victorious when they held on to Basildon, as you'll remember last night. Then after that, tears. I actually saw someone in tears when Chris Patten lost, and there was a palpable shock when he lost at Bath. And in the end, that extraordinary dawn, champagne, Smith Square street party for John Major. But if you want the reason for it all, you remember the banners that were out there early this morning which said simply JM is initials PM? Well, the reason for all that, I was told by a senior Conservative minister, you can have that in initials too. Just the same as John Fryer was saying, it's TAX. They never believed that people would vote for higher taxes, and they think Labour timed their campaign wrongly into the bargain, as David Mellor said.
Thank you very much, Vivian White. Just one thing, what's happening today? Any more going on there, or are you just going to stand out getting the pickings, or is the Prime Minister going down there? Is there going to be a press conference, anything like that, as far as you know?
Not so far as we know. We shall be at your service, of course, and do whatever you require. Chris Patten is at last earning his first rest after the campaign. He predicted he was going to go for a swim, but in fact he took it a little easy after that. We've had a whole parade of ministers here come and go during the night, but the sense of surprise and shock and now a delighted pretense of a return to normality, anything but normal here.
Thanks very much, Vivian. John Cole, BBC's political editor. John, good morning. And this position that was being spelt out on the other table by Shirley Williams and others about what the left or what the non-Conservative parties ought to do, what do you think of it? Do you think there's any way in which the Conservatives can be ousted in the years to come, or is there a real problem on the other side?
Well, I think the opposition parties have a real problem in that while the Conservatives are naturally elated at having their fourth election victory for the first time in this century, we do appear to be moving slightly towards the situation, the political situation, all sorts of other different factors, but the political situation is rather the same as in Italy or in Japan, where one party or one group of parties has ruled. So clearly the opposition parties have to get their act together. But I thought the discussion about proportional representation was a touch unrealistic, because supposing the Liberals, Democrats and the Labour Party did get together and agree that proportional representation was the thing, we do have a Conservative government. It has just won its fourth election on the present system. In the real world of politics, it's not going to introduce it. So when Shirley Williams had said in answer to Peter Sisson's question, is it pie in the sky to think of any realignment, and she went on to the subject of PR, well, I mean, quite frankly, unless they have an electoral pact or realignment, they're not going to get the PR, even if PR were the desirable end. And I mean, many people have great doubts about that, and not only Conservatives. So I don't see, I look at the long-term trend, and I think this is a thing that Liberal Democrats have to address themselves to now when they get over the immediate shock of the thing. In 1983, the Conservative vote has remained through the three elections remarkably consistent, 42, 42, 43, with rounding up or rounding down. Labour had 27.6 and were just 2 points ahead of the Liberal Democrats in 83. They had 30.8 and were about 8 points ahead in 1987, and this time they are double, that is 36 to 18. Now that, for my money, is a trend line, and in their various forms the Alliance and the Liberal Democrats, the third party, whatever you care to call them, have been on the way down. Now they have to consider, I think, whether they hope to reverse that trend, whether they can still hope to replace the Labour Party as the alternative to the Conservatives. Because quite clearly ministers were acknowledging, David Miller, I think, on the other table earlier this morning, that while quite clearly for the victors it's a jolly good thing that they've won, and no politician goes into an election thinking, oh, it's time for a change from me. But nevertheless, we do believe in this country in alternation of governments, and there is a duty not only on Her Majesty's government but on Her Majesty's opposition to get its act together and provide an alternative government. And these two parties at the moment have not succeeded in doing that.
Felicity Goody in Manchester, or in Hyndburn rather, in the northwest, has some Labour Party activists with her, and they may be able to cast some light on what they think Labour should do. Good morning, Felicity.
Good morning, David. I think they may very well be able to, and there really ought to be an air of celebration here, I suppose, in Accrington Town Hall. After all, they've got a Labour MP in Hyndburn for the first time for 10 years, Greg Pope, who joins us. But instead, I've detected among all these people here, MPs and party activists, gloom and a degree of puzzlement. Am I correct, Greg Pope?
We're certainly very disappointed about the national result, although, of course, delighted to win for the first time, as you say, in 10 years in Hyndburn. It's very difficult because I don't think there is a very clear message coming out of the election. Very patchy results. For example, in this part of the northwest, Labour's taken 3 seats in a row, and those very good victories. If we'd repeated those swings across the country, we would probably be the largest party.
Keith Bradley, you're the secretary of the Northwest Group of MPs. You did very well personally. Do you have any explanations as to where the rest of your colleagues, some of your colleagues, went wrong?
No, I think we have to put in context. We've obviously reduced the Tory majority from 101 down to 17, and I think we have to recognise we had a mountain to climb and we've gone a long way up it. But what was clear to me was that at the end of the campaign we weren't punching home the crucial message that we wanted in the North West about the health service, about the needs of the elderly, about the needs of families. And I felt that where we were punching that home clearly, such as in my constituency, then we had the very good results and people clearly recognised the Labour Party was the party for them.
Audrey Wise, you're the MP for Preston. Is there to any extent an argument that maybe the Labour Party has so far lost its way that people no longer see you as an alternative for which they feel inclined to vote? This was a view that Eric Heffer expressed before he died.
I think that we have put alternative policies. It's, in fact, the Liberals and the Tories who've been squabbling over the same votes. Rather than ourselves. We have been distinctive and we have been arguing for a fairer Britain. I'm just very disappointed that some people have been scared into pursuing what they saw mistakenly as their self-interest rather than voting for a fairer Britain. So I think a fairer Britain would help everybody.
But there's a message that doesn't seem to have got through. The message that appears to have got through to people is that under Labour people might be worse off.
Well, they're wrong, but of course when you have the whole of the press against you, it's difficult. And when you have a campaign from your opponents which relies on scare tactics, then of course it is difficult. So we've got to keep on trying harder.
But has the true voice of the party always come through? I wonder because, and maybe here I could ask Colin Feely from the Hyndburn Labour Party, the Hyndburn Labour Party has for some time now been critical of the way in which the voice of the grassroots has not been heard at national level. Are you now paying the price?
I don't think so, not in Hyndburn. I think we've done a terrific job in Hyndburn. What's happened last night, in the last 24 hours, is a major disaster for this country. It's a major disaster for the health service, for education, for the homelessness.
Do you see...
This government won't change anything one iota. They'll keep on going down the same road, punishing the poor, the sick and the needy.
But that's a message, of course, that you've been putting across aggressively on the doorstep. People don't seem to have believed you. Dave Quinn.
I think what the Tories did really is they used the fear and uncertainty and doubt, the FUD factor. And certainly in a lot of the middle-class estates throughout East Lancashire, there were several leaflets on the last day, which were scurrilous, really. I mean, they were saying things, personal attacks against Neil Kinnock, misleading information about our tax plans, really to frighten people into going back to the Tory camp at the last minute.
So basically, none of you are taking any blame for this at all. You're saying it was purely that the public have been bamboozled and there's nothing wrong with Labour Party strategy? Peter Kilford.
Well, I don't think it's a question of blame. I think we've got to put it into perspective. 144-seat majority in 1983. A party that was on the brink of self-destruction. We've come back to a 17-seat majority. We're disappointed, but we're not dismayed. But there has been a very, very negative campaign. And the adage was that such a campaign was not going to be successful. The Tories have been successful. And if I can just make two other points. The polls have totally distorted people's perception of what was going on out there, and there are major question marks about those. And the role of the Liberal Democrats. We've had so much publicity about their breakthrough, they've actually lost a seat out of their total. They're a negative factor which inhibits in many areas the Labour Party coming through. So we're not dismayed.
What about the Kinnock factor, though? Kathleen Tom, I remember you saying that on the doorstep some people in Hyndburn were saying to you, well, of course, the fact that he's Welsh even counts against him.
Well, that did come across quite often. And I think that the fact that, to me, it sounded racist in a way, that, well, he's a Welshman. But as the campaign went along, we did find that we were getting across. His image was coming across very well in that part of Hyndburn.
So should he resign? Should he resign? Does anybody think he should resign?
No.
Yes.
Understandably, he's getting a lot of flack at the moment, but we must do what Peter was saying, get things in perspective. If we go back nearly 10 years, Neil Kinnock took over a demoralised Labour Party. We're now a modern, credible, social democratic Labour Party. We're in the mainstream of politics once again. I think we have not got to lose our nerve or be divided this morning. We must keep our nerve and keep progressing under his leadership.
But you've made a lot of sacrifices. Unions particularly have made a lot of sacrifices. Perhaps I could ask Michael Murray here. Have you perhaps made too many sacrifices? Again, in the interests of party unity?
I don't think we've made too many sacrifices at all. I think we're losing sight of the fact that the gap between government and opposition has narrowed considerably. We are now going to be, in the next 5 years, a most effective opposition. And that's what we've got to concentrate on. We've got to put to one side being led by the media as to whether it's proportionate representation or whether it's the union's fault or whether it's Neil Kinnock's fault. I think what we've got to do is to turn round and say the gap is very close. We can now effectively in Parliament use all our new MPs to be an effective opposition and halt and push back the way that the Tories have rode roughshed not only over ordinary people but over everyone in this country.
But if you all keep telling me how awful the Tories are and how downtrodden the people are under the Conservatives, and yet you failed to be the elected government this morning. Yes.
It's very important. I think Michael's absolutely right about what we do in opposition in Parliament. What we've also got to do is organise on the ground. The campaign in this town was absolutely brilliant, and I say that someone with 30 years' service in the Labour Party, it was brilliant. We had a wonderful agent, which was to some extent luck, of course, a good candidate, of course, but also we had people working together.
We leave Hyndburn to go and hear Paddy Ashdown at the Liberal Party headquarters.
Down the street of Chard in Somerset, with behind me Gavin and David Hughes and John Reid, that they actually look more like the Special Branch than the Special Branch did. Well, there's, my friends, if I began to single out any individual, and I will single out one in a moment, but apart from that, if I began to single out any other, I would not know where to stop. So I have to thank you all from the bottom of my heart, collectively. I'm aware that each and every one of you has sacrificed your time, a very great deal of it, your sleep, your friendships, your family life, your work, to give so much to our campaign. It has been a supremely happy and united campaign. It has been tremendous fun. And I can tell you, for me, out there at the end of a programme that was organised from here, you could feel behind you a campaign that was professional, concerted, determined, and very sharply focused. Each of you, I believe, has cause to be proud of your individual contribution. Each of you should know that I and my parliamentary colleagues and the party are very, very deeply in your debt, each of you personally. I want to tell you, too, how much we all owe to one singular person, the person who planned and executed the campaign, which everyone says was the best campaign, who ensured that we won the arguments, who ensured that we have a real platform for growth, in the next Parliament. Des is right. I had a meeting with Des at Joe Allen's. All meetings with Des seem to be at Joe Allen's, at least all the important ones do. And I asked him to do this job 2 years ago, Des? 2 years ago. Remember where you were. 6% in the opinion polls. Remember what they were saying about us. We would be wiped out. Remember we'd just come behind the Greens in the European election. And Des had faith in us and faith in the party, faith in what we could do, faith in what we stood for. I think it was an act of immense courage on his part, and an act which has cost him a very considerable amount in his family life and much else besides. I know that I could not conceivably have coped with the last 3 months without his steadfastness, his guidance and his help. And he's given our party something quite immeasurable. He's given us a chance in this next Parliament to continue building a powerful third force in this country. Des, we are incalculably in your debt, incalculably so. Right. To the party and those in the country who may be watching, I want to say what an inspiration it's been to travel throughout England, Scotland, Wales, and see how courageously and determinedly you have campaigned in our cause. Given the electoral system, given our starting point, this was never likely to be the general election when we would come top of the poll. Most of you know that we saw this as a development general election, even though we weren't prepared to admit so to some in the press. Of course, we feel some disappointment today, particularly for some of our good colleagues who were lost. Last night was a bad night for all by-election winners, but we are sad indeed not to have with us in Parliament David Bellotti, Mike Carr, Nicola Stevens.
So Paddy Ashdown explaining away the defeat. Remember, the Liberal Democrat vote has fallen in the last 3 elections, 23, 22, 18. You wouldn't think it from hearing him. We've just worked out what under PR, this break-up of seats would have been on the current popular vote. Labour have got 269 at the moment. There'd be 219 under PR. The Conservatives have got 321. Under proportional representation, there'd be 262. And the Liberal Democrats, who have 17, would actually have 111. Peter.
Let's just have a look at Paddy Ashdown's really rather disappointing story tonight. He's 20 seats in the new Parliament, down from 22 in the last one. Look at the share for the Liberal Democrats. Back in the mid-70s there, 19%, down to 14% in 79. The best ever since the war in 1983 for the Alliance was 26%, 23% in 1987. They all hoped it would be at least back to there. But what they've done is they've come down to 18%, less than some of those polls were suggesting later in the campaign, and they've lost net 2 seats as well, 18% for the Liberal Democrats, David.
Tony King, you wanted to say something about the Liberal Democratic performance.
I just wanted to say that Paddy Ashdown is still talking the language of somebody who thinks that one day the Liberal Democrats can be a major political force, possibly even oust the Labour Party as the main opposition party to the Conservatives. I really think that that particular balloon needs to be punctured. The fact is that the Alliance had a real go at it in 1983 under very favourable circumstances, led by people like Roy Jenkins and Shirley Williams. Then you had David Owen and David Steele going at it in 1987. You now have Paddy Ashdown on his own account running an excellent campaign, surrounded by a very unpopular government and a Labour Party that, as we've just seen, is pretty well unelectable. And what happens? The Liberal Democrats actually lose vote share and lose a seat or two in the House of Commons. I think this notion of the Liberal Democrats becoming a major political force in our time, short of acquiring PR, is simply not worth taking seriously.
It's hot air.
It's hot air.
OK. Let's have the news now, because it's coming up to 11 o'clock, or maybe it's just a whisker after 11 o'clock. And we'll be back here again with more analysis of what's gone on. We still have 31 results to come in. We're waiting for Berwick-on-Tweed. Here's Chris Lowe. Welcome back. And the count is going on in Berwick-upon-Tweed. We expect to have that next, the most northerly constituency in Britain, where Lord Lambton used to hold the seat until he resigned, and in November 1973 the Liberals gained this. Alan Beath has been there since then, now Treasury spokesman, fought for the leadership of the Liberal Democrats, and we shall have his result a bit later on. It's due in 10 or 15 minutes, I think. While we wait for that, some of the younger and more ambitious members of the Conservative Party are here. I'm surprised they dare leave their telephones, but maybe they have poser phones with them, and they're with Peter Sissons.
Yeah, they're all bugged. Now, 4 Ministers of State from John Major's government who all held their seats with varying degrees of ease or difficulty. John Redwood's votes, well, they weigh them in your part of the world, don't they? John Redwood, Angela Rumbold, Michael Portillo and Virginia Bottomley. Virginia Bottomley, what effect on this campaign did the War of Jennifer's Ear have? Did it cost Labour?
I think it did. I mean, time and again, Labour tried to run health scare stories. They had endless press conferences on health. But actually, the facts spoke louder than their fantasies and their scare stories.
William Walgrave is widely perceived to have snatched defeat from the jaws of victory there. Do you think he did himself some harm? He wasn't seen in the campaign thereafter.
On the contrary, what William's done over the months is to build up good working relations with the doctors, with the nurses. And actually, the campaign coincided with these remarkable results about falling waiting lists, about increased activity. The tragedy of that great event about Jennifer's Ear was it coincided with guys, for example, that everybody used to speak about, actually saying what had happened over the past year.
But let's talk about the future now. Do you expect to join the Cabinet?
I want to stay what I'm doing. We're in the middle of a change in the health service. We want to carry on with it.
You're honestly saying you would turn down a cabinet job if it were offered to do what you're doing?
Well, I know that people like you think that people like us are constantly longing to change, but actually most of us get tremendously committed to what we're doing anyway. And the thing that most exasperated me during the campaign was all those health service people terrified that Labour would get in with an act of vandalism, put aside trusts, put aside fund holders. I actually believe in the health service. I'm convinced that what we're doing is improving the health service, and I want to continue doing that so that we can carry on having one of the best health services in the world.
Now, Michael Portillo, you don't have to do a party election broadcast now, Virginia Bottomley.
But it's the cynical people like you who think that we don't actually feel very strongly about what we're doing and feel very committed to it.
Michael Portillo, the man tipped by the Press Association's political editor as the eventual successor to John Major.
Well,
that should keep you out of the Cabinet.
It's a particularly silly tip to make the day that John Major has just been returned with such an authoritative majority. I mean, John Major has stamped his authority on this election victory. He kept his nerve during all the period when the polls were going against him. He showed, I thought, the same absolute determination and coolness that he showed during the Gulf War. And he emerges from this with his authority immensely enhanced. And today we shall now see him able to form a government of the sort entirely as he wishes, with absolute authority.
What are your priorities? You're the man who used to think the poll tax was a good thing.
Well, I don't know what I may be doing after this election, but I will talk about the poll tax very happily and say that I think that the role that the poll tax played during the general election was possibly favourable to us, in that the election was largely about whether you wanted high taxation under Labour or low taxation under the Conservatives. And in the very moment of the campaign, Labour councils were sending out high tax bills, high community charge bills, which proved to people the connection between the Labour Party and high taxation. It was only a short jump in their minds then to make the connection between electing Labour to Westminster and having high taxes at Westminster too.
Now, Angela Rumbold, you're the nearest the government had to or has to a Minister for Women. Is it time for a ministry for women?
Certainly not. I don't think anyone has ever wanted a ministry for women. And I think if you look at the results today, you will see that the women voted for the government for the policies that were most sensible and affected them best.
What are you going to do for women? Because everywhere you look, this is the issue that working mothers, single parents want to raise.
My single parents and my working mothers were all coming out and supporting us. They were saying that they thought the Conservative policies were the best ones, that they did best under the Conservative
But your majority
government.
was slashed.
My majority was the result of the Labour Party trying to target seats in London, particularly mine. The tactics they used were really rather crude tactics, and clearly the electorate didn't want them.
But is it time for a woman in the Cabinet?
I have no idea what John Major is going to do. It's entirely up to him. He's now got to look at the people who are elected, and he will choose the best people to run the ministries that he wants, and I wish him every success in that.
But there isn't a woman in the cabinet. It must be time for women in the cabinet.
John Major,
around this table, we have,
yeah.
if I may say so, the two, since Linda Chalker lost her seat, the two prime candidates. Now, come on, be candid with us. You would love to join John Major's cabinet if asked.
Of course we'd love to join John Major's...
No, she wouldn't. She wants to stay where she is.
No. we would love to join John Major's cabinet if he asks us and if he thinks that we're the best people to do the job. I don't want to get there simply because I'm a woman. I'm fed up to the back teeth with being told that I've got to get there because I'm a woman. I want to get there on merit. I hope that some of us will get in there because we are the best people to do the job.
John Redwood, you were head of Mrs Thatcher's policy unit for a couple of years, closely identified with her. Is she, now that John Major has his own mandate, going to become, very gradually, a non-person?
No, she won't become a non-person. She'll be a respected elder stateswoman. But the agenda has moved on and the people have moved on. We're all looking forward through the 90s to the next millennium, with John Major with an exciting agenda of change and reform where we need improvements, and continuity and stability where we don't. Above all, we want to believe in a Britain that is something in the world, that counts for something, is a respected ally, which is an important member of the European community. That is what John Major's leadership offers us. That is what Neil Kinnock could not do for this country, as the electorate have just decided.
You see, when you have a majority of 17, it's arguable that conviction politics could get you into trouble, whereas consensus politics, a return to consensus politics, could actually prolong the life of the government. Is that the sort of theory that you would subscribe to?
You need principles in politics so that people know where you come from, but you need sensitivity to the nuances of public opinion. And that is what I think John Major combines extremely well in the way he leads our party and in the way he's led us through this election. We have listened to what the electors are telling us. Yeah. There are things we have to improve, which we will improve over the next 5 years, but there are core principles, conservative beliefs in freedom and enterprise, which will go on.
All right, what's the biggest single priority for the next government?
Well, the first priority is to lift the economy out of the recession that has dogged us and the other leading countries over recent months. And that is only possible with John Major and the Conservative team. We've seen the results today. The stock market up 160 points at the opening, money market rates beginning to ease, the pound much stronger against the Deutsche market. It would have been the other way round if there had been Liberal and Labour politicians with their hands on the lever of power.
Now, we're always told that John Major is a listening politician. Here's your chance to give him a bit of advice. If you could give him one word of advice, Virginia Bottomley, or one sentence of advice, what would it be as he sets out on as his own man?
I'd say, congratulations. We're all absolutely delighted.
That's not advice.
Those who knew him closely knew that he had this tremendous cool, tremendous ability.
Advice.
Yes, it is. And my advice is to keep going and doing what he believes is right, because he speaks for the nation. And that's what all of us have found on the doorsteps. When you talk to people, they feel comfortable with John Major, they have confidence in him, they respect him. He's a tried and a trusted Prime Minister. Trust your own judgment.
Michael Portillo, advice.
I think he found the themes during the general election, which is to move more and more power down to the individual, away from bureaucracies, and to defend the United Kingdom.
I must stop you there, because we're going to go to Alan Beath's declaration at Berwick-upon-Tweed.
Results are few and far between today, and we have this one just coming in from Berwick-on-Tweed.
Was as follows. Gordon Johnson Adam,
Labour,
9,933. Alan James Beath,
Liberal Democrat,
19,283. Anthony William Henfrey,
Conservative,
14,240. And that the said Alan James Beath has been duly elected to serve as member for the said constituency.
So Alan Beath returned, his majority down by almost 5,000, 4,500.
Well, first, ladies and gentlemen, a very warm thanks to the returning officer and to all his staff and to the police, and for all who've been involved in organising an election which went smoothly, and particularly a count which went very smoothly. Many thanks for all the work that's been put in over very long hours. Then many thanks to my opponents, who have fought a respectable and civilised campaign which the constituency can reasonably be proud, and I thank them for doing so. Very warm and special thanks to my agent Jane Young, and for all who worked with her in the team to create this result. And a special thanks, too, for my wife and family for all the support they've given me and all they've put up with during this and the long period which has run up to this election campaign. I want to thank also those who've helped me over the years to try to provide a regular service as Member of Parliament to this constituency, which has taken a lot of voluntary effort and voluntary help by a lot of people. I am delighted to be continuing to serve as the Member of Parliament for the Berwick-on-Tweed constituency. It's a job I love, and it's a job to which I intend to continue to devote all my efforts. And I want to say to John Major, whom I congratulate on his return as Prime Minister, that he must listen to the voices of the majority of voters who did not vote for him and his party, to the voters all over the country, 18% of them who voted Liberal Democrat, and to the voters in this constituency who elected me, that he must listen to all their concerns about the education system, about the health service, about the future of our economy and of our country. And it is up to him now to show that with his much reduced majority, he is not simply going to ignore the real verdict of the people, but to take it into account. And my job as Member of Parliament for this constituency, along with my Liberal Democrat colleagues in the significant team of MPs we have, will be to make sure that he has to listen by reminding him repeatedly about these concerns and about the needs of this particular constituency, which I shall be proud to serve. Thank you very much.
Sir Alan Beith at Berwick-on-Tweed with his victory, though his majority almost halved there, and the Conservative and Labour vote substantially up in percentage terms. In a moment I'm going to be talking to Sir David Steele, former leader of the Liberal Party and leader of the Alliance with David Owen, who's in his conservatory at Ettrick Bridge. But first, let's just have a reminder of what happened to the Liberal Democrats yesterday in the general election voting.
Well, after all the effort that Alan Beith referred to, it has been a disappointing night for Paddy Ashdown and his Liberal Democrat Party. 17 seats, 4 gains, 5 losses. And the share of the vote, 18%, as Alan Beith said, down 5% on what the Alliance had in 1987. And just a picture of their the new geography of the Liberal Democrats in Scotland. Really most of their seats are lumped in Scotland. There are 8 of them in Scotland, down 1. They've lost Kincardine. In the north, 3, down 2. In Wales, they've lost 1 seat. Their only real success has been down in the south of England, where they now have 5. They're up 3. They've gained Cheltenham, Devon North, Cornwall North and Bath. That's the net change there in the south. And their forecast, they're going to end up like this. As you will see now, their totals adding up there to 20, and the net changes, doing best on the whole in the south. And so that is the picture of the Liberal Democrats. Our forecast is they'll have 20 seats, down 2 and where they were before. A disappointing night for them. 3 seats short of their best in 1983, David.
Thank you very much, Peter. Sir David in Ettrick Bridge, I'd like you, if you would, just to listen to this interview, which we've recorded with Ian McWhirter in Scotland. I want to ask you to comment on it, and then I'll be asking you also about the position of the Liberal Democrats. This is about the future of Scotland.
Well, there have been large helpings of humble pie consumed in Scotland this morning. The media, the pollsters, the pundits, the politicians, indeed, all got it wrong. Or did they? Because if you look at the results, in terms of share of the vote, the Conservatives are at 25%, broadly speaking where they were in 1987. Labour are still up at just under 40%. They got 42% in 1987. And the real change has been that the SNP increased their vote by something like 50%. Again, that was predicted by the opinion poll. But what no one predicted was the extent to which this would destabilise the result and allow Conservative MPs back in seats they lost in 1987 through tactical voting. Now, they are certainly not regarding this as a vindication of the constitutional status quo. Earlier, the chair of the Constitutional Convention Executive, Canon Kenyon Wright, told me that this was indeed the time, possibly, for resistance by that institution.
Well, somebody said the polls were wrong, the people were right. I would say that in Scotland, at least if the people were right, the people voted substantially for devolution, in a majority for devolution, and in a massive majority for constitutional change.
How can you say that, though? Because the Conservatives are back with more seats than they held before, and yet it was your conviction, and the people on the convention all predicted that the Tories would be wiped out.
Well, I made no prediction. I simply said that the Scottish people would vote massively for constitutional change and that the majority would support our scheme. That is exactly what has happened. The Conservatives have increased their vote by a very small percentage, and they've done so because of a campaign in which they deliberately tried to get across to the Scottish people that the only options were either the status quo or total independence. To some extent, marginally, that has succeeded. But it does not alter the fact, and this is the fact that I think people south of the border have to appreciate and understand, and that is that 6 out of 7 of Scottish MPs are for constitutional change, and 3 out of 4 of the Scottish electorate are for constitutional change.
Well, what can you do with that? Because the Conservatives are satisfied that this result means that they can ignore the calls for home rule, for constitutional change for Scotland. What can the Constitutional Convention do to counter that?
Constitutionally, the Conservatives, of course, have a case, given our flawed constitution in Great Britain. Morally, however, the right of a government with a very small majority, elected by a minority of the people, even in the UK as a whole, to govern Scotland against its will, undemocratically, against its massively expressed will, that, I think, is highly questionable. What can the Convention do? Well, that's a very good question, and I wish I knew the full answer to it. But I'm quite sure there are certain things we have to do. We are meeting very shortly to discuss all of this. We have to broaden the base of the Convention even further.
You mean to try to get, say, the Scottish National Party, who boycotted the Convention, to join?
Yes, and others. I think we are at the stage now where the Scottish people don't get what they want because partly of their constant tendency to disunity. I think we've got to create a base of unity which is broad as possible and as deep as possible, which stretches down into grassroots organisations throughout Scotland.
Well, you said if this result were to come to pass, as has happened, the Conservatives are returned much as before, that the Convention would have to become a focus for resistance. Now, what did you mean by that?
I meant, I think, exactly what I said. This is obviously not the occasion. It would be wrong to start going into all the tactics of that. But what I basically meant was that if we have a situation, and we appear to have that now, where the democratic will of the Scottish people, constantly expressed, massively expressed, continues to be denied, continues to be thwarted, we simply cannot wait for another 5 years for another election. That there have to be other ways in which the Scottish people express that. Now, exactly what these ways are is something we have to discuss with all the component parts of the Convention, with local authorities, with the trade union movement, with the churches, with the business community, that part of it which is in the Convention, and others.
Now, you aren't going to give away your tactics just now, clearly, but are you talking in broad terms about forms of civil disobedience?
I have said on more than one occasion in the past that I rule out nothing except violence. That doesn't mean that I necessarily rule anything in either. I think one has to look at all options which are both possible and effective.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
David Steele, you were listening to that. What does the Venerable Canon, do you think, mean by a focus for resistance and not ruling out civil disobedience? Is that a good way forward for Scotland?
I think what we ought to do is meet in the Convention Executive, as we are going to do, exactly a week today. And I think, if I may borrow John Major's phrase, we ought to take stock between now and then. Like him, I wouldn't like to anticipate what that meeting will decide or what we'll recommend to the full Convention. But I would say that I agree with Ian McWhirter's analysis of what's happened here in Scotland. The fact is that we had a great unity for constitutional change. If I take you back to the Govan by-election, when Jim Sillars won that by-election, unfortunately, that was the point at which that unity was fractured, because he persuaded the SNP, and I think it was largely him, not to come into the Convention. And you saw SNP votes rising throughout Scotland. The Conservative vote didn't rise, but they got more seats back because the SNP siphoned off votes from the Labour Party in some seats and from us in other seats, and thereby allowed the Tories back in. And the danger in Scottish politics is you get this conflict between the government saying we're not prepared to consider any kind of reform of the Union, the electorate, 75% of them saying we want reform, and the SNP therefore feeding on this resistance to any kind of change. And I think that's a very dangerous situation, and I hope that John Major will take full account of it.
But just deal with this word civil disobedience. Are you in favour of civil disobedience?
I'm not quite sure what civil disobedience means. I'm certainly in favour of political action, not non-political action. And I hope very much that we can keep ourselves to political action. But what we have to do is try and get the political parties together. I agree with what the Canon said. We've got to try and persuade the more sensible elements in the SNP and indeed some elements in the Scottish Conservative Party to come into the convention and proceed with us.
Come, David Steele, if you would, to the Liberal Democrats' position in the country as a whole. You've lost seats and you've lost votes 3 elections running now. You went 23%, 22%, and now you're down to 18%. Is there any future for the Liberal Democrats?
I think your figures aren't quite right, David. I think it was 25%.
25, sorry.
And 23%. No, I mean, the fact is that
it's even worse then, really?
Well,
steeper
no,
decline.
I don't accept that. This was Paddy Ashdown's first election campaign. It was a lot better than my first election campaign in '79. The result is better. He fought a very good campaign, and I think the one thing that marked this campaign out from the last 2, even though it wasn't so successful in votes or seats, where it was very successful, I think, was in highlighting the constitutional issue. And what I think we've got now to take stock in the opposition parties is whether we're going to make progress on electoral reform, and I hope very much that the Labour Party will very shortly consider the promise they made during the election to broaden the Plant Commission if they were in government. I think they should now do that in opposition, and they should send out invitations to us, to the Welsh and Scottish Nationalists and anybody else interested in coming in to get a more broadly based commission on the subject of electoral reform. These constitutional issues must now come to the fore. I think Paddy Ashdown was successful in bringing them to the fore during the election campaign.
Every general election, well, the last 2 anyway, you seem to sit in that conservatory thinking up new wheezes for getting the Liberal Democrats back on the road, David Steele.
It's not a new wheeze, David. I'm reinforcing what Paddy successfully did during the election campaign, which was to bring electoral reform, which has been on the back burner for so long, right onto the front burner now. And I'm putting it to the Labour Party that they ought to implement in opposition what they said they would do in government. And I think that is a sensible way forward in a situation where a minority Conservative party has again managed to secure a majority in the House of Commons.
Well, Lord Jenkins is listening to you. He's been victim of some of your wheezes and party to some of your wheezes. Lord Jenkins, what do you think the Liberal Democrats should do?
What I think the Liberal Democrats should do is not to pronounce on the morning after an election what they're going to do in the next Parliament. I have rather learnt from the post-83 and the post-87 experience. Post-83, when in fact we'd done very well, we got 25%, as David Steele was saying. I resigned almost immediately, maybe a bit too quickly. Post-87, we plunged, David Steele and I were in agreement, as we mostly are, but we probably rushed in a bit too much, a bit too quickly to the merger arrangements at that time. And my new rule of politics is don't make dispositions for the Parliament on the morning after the poll.
Well, it was in that very conservatory we're looking at that this merger was planned and first talked about, wasn't it, David Steele, or have I got it wrong? I mean, that's where we first heard about it.
No, David Steele and I...
It was talked about, yes. Sorry, right.
No, go on, David Steele.
Before that.
The night before?
No, a lot before.
Oh, a lot before.
Yeah, a lot before. I agree with that.
But it became public from where you're sitting now. Anyway, that's a minor point. The question is, David, what's going to happen to the parties that are against the Conservatives? I mean, we've now had, as has been pointed out endlessly in this studio last night and today, this substantial Conservative vote that doesn't seem to shift of around the 42-43% mark. And as long as there are 2 parties on the left, it seems impossible, statistically, for either of you to shift them. What do you think should be done? Is there any way of getting...
Well, now you are trying to push me in the direction which Roy Jenkins quite wisely says we shouldn't go. I don't think we can say what the Liberal Democrats will do until we've had time to take stock after this election. What I do repeat is that I think that Paddy Ashdown, having got electoral reform for the first time, I mean, Roy and I tried it, we didn't succeed, but he's got it onto the agenda in the middle of the election campaign. That's a major achievement. We must build on that. And I think, I repeat that I think the Labour Party should be challenged to do what they said they would do if they'd been in the government, to do it in opposition, and let's have the Plant Commission broadened to include all those concerned about constitutional reform.
So you would treat it rather like the Scottish Convention. You'd try and get prior agreement between the Liberals or the Liberal Democrats and Labour on a way forward, and then present it as a joint party platform. Is that what you're thinking of?
You're pushing too far.
Well, I'm only curious.
No, all right, but we haven't got agreement so far. All I'm saying is that I think we should now take steps to push the electoral reform case in every way possible.
Well, we have another
you just told us that we would have had 111 seats in the Liberal Democrats if we'd had PR. The result would have been very different, and I think that we have really got to keep on, in other words, continue the momentum of the election campaign, which I think Paddy Ashdown conducted brilliantly, and keep this issue to the fore.
We're joined by another member of the left, Lord Donoghue, advisor to Harold Wilson. And Lord Donoghue, what do you think of this? How do you think either Labour or the Liberal Democrats has any hope of unseating the Conservatives before the end of the century?
Well, obviously, the opposition parties have to look very carefully at how they can unseat a Conservative majority of seats on a minority of votes, which has happened again and again. And I think the Labour Party will have to look even more positively. They have looked positively at electoral reform. They will have to look at it more positively. And the Liberal Democrats, I think, will have to accept, on declining performance, that as things are going at present, they score enough votes and enough seats to prevent Labour getting a majority, but under the present system have no hope of ever getting more than a couple of dozen seats. So the opposition parties, I think, have to look very carefully at how together, and that doesn't necessarily mean by any formal arrangement, but on how we can make a progress towards stopping a minority party constantly securing a majority government.
Reading between the lines, it must mean that there is a pact of some kind where either one party or the other fights the Tories in the constituencies.
Well, I think, as David Steele was suggesting, you don't necessarily have to do things by very formal pacts, especially in advance. You have all kinds of problems if you're looking at agreeing to drop out of one constituency or another constituency. I think that can be very hard. But I think sensible, experienced politicians can get together and see ways of making progress. And the Labour Party's got to do that, and the Liberal Democrats got to do that.
Let me bring in the man who was perhaps most responsible for modernising the appearance, the image, and to a certain degree the policy of the Labour Party, who's now the MP for Hartlepool. Peter Mandelson, good morning. Thank you for joining us. Have you been able to hear what's been said here about the problems of unseating the Conservatives, the problems on the other side, on the left of British politics?
Yes, I've been listening to it with great interest.
Well, what do you make of it? Do you think there is a way forward, first of all, for the Labour Party, and secondly, for the Labour Party perhaps in cooperation with the Liberal Democrats?
Well, I'm not against cooperation in principle, and I'm not against reforming the electoral system in principle, but I'd rather consider that on the merits of the case. What I would like to hear, though, is an explanation as to how, simply by putting forward or advocating a change in the electoral system, the Labour Party will be winning more votes and attracting more support for the ideas and the policies and the programme we're setting forward, because at the end of the day, that's what wins elections, not providing some electoral device or some reform of the electoral system.
Well, don't you assume that the Liberal Democrats would think to themselves that if you supported PR, like Mr Ashdown, you'd make it your first claim on the electorate's attention and therefore withdraw from seats where they, the Liberal Democrats, were in second place?
Well, I think we made that claim on the electorate's attention at the end of last week, when we held a press conference and set out some ideas and put forward some proposals on electoral reform. Now, it just so happens that electoral reform is not a salient issue for the electorate. It's not a strong suit for the Labour Party. And I think one of the problems for our campaign in this last week, and certainly in the last 48 hours of the campaign, is that by igniting a long-running discussion about electoral reform and hung parliaments and instability in government, we deflected our own campaign from the real issues which were of concern to the electorate: the recession, the state of the National Health Service and other public services, and the widening inequalities in our society. And I think in the last 48 hours of our campaign, that might well have become quite a problem for us.
Peter Mandelson, thank you very much. Lord Jenkins, last word from you before we go over to Peter Snow for yet another graphic assessment of the election campaign.
Well, last word, I think, is this election result raised a lot of things people have got to think about in both the Labour Party and the Liberal Democrat Party. I would think it does very seriously raise the question as to whether a party so constituted as the Labour Party is at present can ever, in the conditions of late 20th century Britain, hope to win a majority on its own. Now, we've got to think, too, exactly what our future is. But as I told you earlier, I'm sure the Friday morning is not the right time to do negotiations or make detailed plans. But obviously we are in a new political landscape, and we better have some new bearings in a new political landscape.
Lord Donoghue?
Could I just make a positive point? I reject the disaster scenario that's in the air and in television studios. You have to remember the Labour Party will have won about 40 seats. And the Labour Party has only done that once before in the war. That was in 1964-6. The Conservatives have only done it a couple of times. If we were not comparing Labour's performance with expectations, the commentators would be saying what a remarkably successful election campaign
the
Labour
expectations were Neil Kinnock's. He was the one who said he was going to have a majority of 20,
well,
not the commentators.
Regardless of whose fault, putting it in historic context, this is the second best Labour Party election performance in the post-war period, and therefore you shouldn't write the Labour Party off too easily.
Lord Donoghue, thank you. Well, we've talked about the parties of the left, the Liberal Democrats and the Labour Party, and the consequences for them. Let's go back now to the position of the Conservatives, who, just to remind you, stand on our prediction to win this election. I don't exactly have the figure here. Yes, I do. A majority of 17 overall. 620 results in. We've got 30 results still to come. But let's now have a reminder of where the Conservatives stand. Peter.
Well, David, here's how John Major then went to score the Conservatives' fourth successive victory, the first time the party's done it since the beginning of the last century. Here's John Major now with 321 seats, 5 to go before he crosses that vital winning line of 326, 9 gains, 44 losses. So the share of the vote, 43%, shows no change at all on the 1987 success when Mrs Thatcher had a majority of 100. 43% the share of the vote. And here's a look at the way the share of the vote for the Tories has changed all over the country. Actually went up 2% in Scotland. Labour went down. The Tories took a Labour seat, Aberdeen South. In the north, no change in the Conservative vote. Notice, as we come down the country, how the vote does drop ever so slightly. The recession obviously is having some impact on the Tory vote. The south, we've coloured the lightest, the palest blue, because that's where the Tories did worse. But it's still only 2% down in 87. Probably the recession there having some effect on the Tory vote. But on the whole, only a tiny swing to Labour nationally, just 2% swing. Where Labour scored was in the marginal seats. So Labour actually did better in terms of seats than they really should have done in terms of the share of the vote. Here now are the Conservative losers. There's Chris Patten, the party chairman, out in Bath. Linda Chalker, she really almost had to lose. 279 was her majority last time in Wallasey, the Overseas Development Minister. She's out. Francis Maud, the driving force of the privatisation policies of the government the last few years, Financial Secretary of the Treasury in Warwickshire North, he's out. He had quite a thin majority last time. And Colin Moynihan, Energy Minister, perhaps better known as the former Sports Minister, and Cox in the Cambridge boat, he's out at Lewisham East. And now we have just a reminder of one record the Conservatives have put up, among many others. Here's Bernard Law in 1922 with 38%. He won the election in 1922 with 38% of the vote. Mrs Thatcher won with a majority of 100 in 1987 with 43.3% of the vote, and now scoring the second record to Bernard Law's in this century with a winning score of 42.6% of the vote. John Major gets an overall majority in this Parliament. So there he is, he's second to Bernard Law for scoring the lowest share of the vote and yet winning an overall majority, David.
Thank you very much, Peter. Well, we're joined now by the distinguished Conservative historian, Lord Blake, who's in Norwich. Lord Blake, thank you very much for waiting for us. I gather you've been there some time, and I'm sorry about that.
Oh, that's quite all right.
Just tell me, there's been a lot of talk from the Labour and Liberal Democrats here in their disappointment about the danger of a fourth Conservative term. Do you see any dangers in a fourth Conservative term?
No, I don't, actually. I am, of course, a supporter of the Conservative Party, so I suppose I wouldn't be likely to consider there'd be much danger in it. It's a unique performance. They've never won 4 general elections in succession before, but I don't see any great danger in it. I think that they will be able to carry on all right. They've got a majority, instead of 17, and that's about the sort of majority that Winston Churchill had in 1951, I think. And the Conservatives were able to carry on perfectly well for 3.5 years until they Anthony Eden chose to have a dissolution of Parliament, but they could have lasted the full time.
But speaking as a historian, do politicians go stale, or do they become arrogant when they're in office for too long a period, or are they capable of constant regeneration?
I think they're capable of regeneration. There'll be a lot of quite new people in this Parliament compared with people who were there when in 1979. There is, of course, a slight danger of arrogance, but I think having had their majority clipped as much as it has been, because it is down very heavily, in fact, a certain modesty may occur. I think they may be prepared to watch what's happening rather more carefully than they did in the country in the last Parliament.
What do you say to the other parties, to the Liberal Democrats and the Labour Party? I mean, you presumably think they have a role to play in British politics. How do you think they should go about playing that role properly?
Well, I think they're in an awkward position, as a matter of fact. But there it is. The job of an opposition is to oppose, as Disraeli or someone said, and I don't see why they shouldn't act with vigour, criticise government policies, and so on. But of course, in a parliament in which the government has a clear majority, as the Conservatives appear to have, there are quite severe limits to what the opposition can do.
How does it compare with Lord Liverpool, this record?
Well, it's interesting you should say that. Lord Liverpool is the last Prime Minister who won 4 general elections running for the Tories. And but that was rather a long while ago. He was Prime Minister for 15 years. He was, I'm afraid, described by Disraeli as the arch-mediocrity, which was extremely unfair judgment. Actually, he was an able, hard-working, but not perhaps very glamorous politician. But the world of voting and so on in those days, between 1812 and 1827, was, of course, very, very different.
Were you expecting yourself to be giving advice about a hung Parliament today, or did you believe John Major would win?
I thought John Major would win, actually. I wasn't going to be dogmatic about it at all, but I thought if I had to bet, I would have betted on something like this kind of result. But obviously a hung Parliament was a possibility. One couldn't pretend otherwise. And I would have had certain views about it, but I don't think there's any point in expressing them now.
We'll wait till the next election, perhaps, Lord Blake.
Perhaps we could have a similar interview at the next election, yes.
Thank you very much indeed.
Not at all. Nice to talk to you.
We've had the Conservative result in from Chelsea. This is, in marginality terms, the safest Conservative seat in the country. Nicola Scott has taken it, a swing of just 1% in Chelsea against the Conservatives, Labour in second place, and a Labour hold in Wentworth, former mining seat in Rotherham, not Wentworth where the golf course is, in South Yorkshire this, and Peter Hardy holds that, and a swing of 2% to Labour, and a very healthy majority, 22,500 for Peter Hardy.